Hello, and welcome to Hub Dialogues. I'm Theo Argitis, editor-at-large for Business and Economics at the Hub. Today we're unpacking one of the big questions coming out of Canada's recent federal election. What does it mean when older Canadians, the baby boom generation, emerge as the decisive political force? In this election, older voters helped deliver a strong minority mandate to Mark Carney's Liberals. But what kind of economic agenda did that outcome reflect? And what does it all mean for younger generations trying to build their futures today? To explore those questions, I'm joined by Paul Kershow. He's a professor at the University of British Columbia and founder of Generation Squeeze. He's also one of the country's most influential voices on generational fairness, housing, and the economics of aging. Paul, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us.
It's good to be with you.
For our listeners and viewers who may not be acquainted with your work, tell us a little bit about Generation Squeeze and what's the mission, what's the mandate?
Thanks for that question. So Generation Squeeze vision is a Canada that works for all generations. And to achieve that vision, we champion the idea of generational fairness. And at its simplest, the idea is, hey, each generation should leave at least as much as it inherited. And we champion that idea in order to safeguard values that Canadians hold sacred, like a healthy childhood, a healthy home, a healthy retirement, a healthy planet. And I think the other thing to know about Generation Squeeze is that we're not just a think tank. I'm a professor at UBC, where I know that evidence is but one factor that shapes public policy. And political science teaches us all the time that politics responds to those who organize and show up. So we are a think and change tank, and we're trying to empower the evidence in the world of politics so that parties of all ideological stripes respond to the evidence as much as anything else.
All right. And this election, older Canadians clearly played a decisive role. I mean, we saw how polls show they were particularly animated by concerns around Donald Trump. Why do you think that was?
Well, I think we should acknowledge that baby boomers have played a pretty significant role in our politics throughout their lives. The key difference now is that they're at a later life course stage where their interests align with the needs of healthy retirements. I also think that the data show that those over 65 have the lowest levels of poverty, the highest levels of wealth. They tend to be home owners, many of them are. So they have quite a lot of financial security. And so when you see President Trump coming and attacking both the economy and then potentially even our sovereignty, that's a massive source of insecurity to which Canadians have responded. Now, younger Canadians are responding to that as well, but they are already experiencing another kind of insecurity. They are struggling with higher rents, higher mortgages, crushed dreams of home ownership. They're going to school more, paying more for the privilege to land jobs that actually pay less than boomers earned at the same time in their lives if you adjust for inflation. And they face those higher housing prices. And that is the private vice grip in which they find themselves. And that private vice grip in the economy is tightened still further because they're inheriting larger government debts and larger environmental debts. And so that's a whole bunch of sources of insecurity that were also more top of mind for a younger demographic, in addition to the risks from President Trump. And so I think there's a wider risk scope for younger folks that they were asking politicians to respond to. The aging part of our population, the boomers in our lives who we love, they have a narrower risk scope. And also our country has long been oriented toward addressing the risks later in life through medical care and old age security. And so it's kind of baked into the politics in the way that addressing housing concerns and challenges of actually getting launched into the economy successfully weren't such an issue. And we haven't built, public policy traditions around them.
Poll suggested in the lead up to the election, anyways, we'll see kind of the post-election polls come out or the surveys come out soon. But the polls leading up to the election suggest that they were leaning towards the Conservatives more than they had in the past. Do you think that's a structural kind of trend, or do you think this was just a one-off in this election?
I think it's both and more so than either or. I think there's I think there's an incumbency issue, and the hub, for instance. I think you coined the phrase the lost liberal decade. I think I would push back at that in other conversations, which said it's been a lost decade in Ontario under the Conservatives, it's been a lost decade in BC under the NDP. This isn't such an ideological issue. There are structural things that are evolving that makes hard work not pay off for younger people today as it did in the past. And politics has been remarkably slow to respond to that. Mr. Poilievre, for multiple years, actually, I think did a good job taking a lot of the Generation Squeeze analysis of the problem that hard work doesn't pay off for younger folks like it used to. And then he sometimes simplified the solutions, and it was useful for him for a while to say the problem was a particular prime minister, Justin Trudeau. I think the reality is the solution is required is more than just replacing that particular leader. And we have a lot of work to do to improve on the housing front, to make sure childcare doesn't cost another rent size payment, to actually invest in post-secondary right now at a level that makes going there, a good return on investment, as opposed to just a source of major debt to then land jobs that don't pay very well.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that this kind of older demographic voting power, the boomer, let's call it the boomer voting power, has been around for a while. I mean, how does that reflected in economic policy? I mean, is there such a thing as a boomer economic agenda in this country?
Is there a boomer economic agenda? I don't think there's a boomer economic agenda. I think politics has been responding to that large demographic throughout their life course. For two reasons. They're numerically a large group. That's why we called them a boom. And they also have a turnout rate at the ballot box that has been higher than those who've been following in their footsteps. And so for those two reasons, I track policy investments in economic data from the mid-'70s onward. In the mid-'70s, that was sort of the peak of boomers being young people. And if you go back and you look at our provincial governments, then we were investing considerably more on education and social issues by comparison with medical care, because medical care wasn't as prominent a need of boomers at that time. But slowly but surely, that has absolutely reversed. And starting around the year 2000, we saw that really medical care in our provincial budget started taking more and more of the revenue than did investments in education and social services. And, that's because we started to have, the aging population creep up and up. And now we're a quarter century later, and all of the time at the provincial level and at the, for medical care, and at the federal level with regards to old age security, that is where the bulk of revenue is going from economic growth. And we haven't had enough economic growth, in part because an aging population, through no fault of those who are getting older, just the reality of having an aging population is an economic drag on our economy. So growth can't keep up with declining productivity. And we, some decades ago, didn't plan enough revenue collection for the healthy retirements that boomers were planning on. And now, whether you are the NDP government in BC, the Conservative government in Ontario, or the Liberal government in Ottawa, notice my nonpartisanship. You are running large deficits that reflect the mismatch of the cost of serving the boomer population and the inability to do so without running deficits with the way that we've organized our taxes over the last decades. We didn't create a pool of surplus money for old age security and medical care like we did for the Canada Pension Plan, even though it's exactly the same demographic forces that are driving our fiscal challenges now.
Yeah, so we're paying the price for mistakes we've made in the past. But how do you correct that problem now? I think you've used the term New Deal for young people, I think is how you've phrased it in the past. Fine, we made those mistakes a decade or 2 decades ago. How do you fix the problem today without undermining kind of fiscal prudence and undermining our ability to finance other things by government?
It's a great question. So I would say the moral of the story is better late than never. I think we need to recognize that it was in the mid-1990s when then it was Prime Minister Chrétien's government who said prudently that we're going to make the Canada Pension Plan effectively bankrupt if we didn't increase premiums by 60%, and they did in the mid-1990s. They also had a plan for old age security, which was on the books until 1999, and then they abandoned it, I guess, for political reasons. And they engaged the provincial governments in conversations as well. And that mattered because the provinces have disproportionate responsibility for medical care, and they didn't act. So the problem really has its source almost at least 30 years ago, when we saw this problem and we didn't act. But then better late than never. Like if we don't act now, we're in serious trouble. I think the key conversation to have is one with financially secure older Canadians, most generally who are boomers, and to ask an older demographic, is it possible for you to consider accepting less or contributing more? I think the accepting less is often an easier sell in Canadian politics. So here's one of the key issues on which I currently focus. It might surprise your listeners to learn that a retired couple can have $180,000 of income and still be entitled to a full old age subsidy, which will be about $18,000 a year. Let me say that again. $180,000 of income in retirement still qualifies you for an $18,000 OAS subsidy. You didn't pay into OAS in amount commensurate to that $18,000 subsidy. That's just the subsidy we offer to those who are entitled now. By contrast, if you are a family collecting the Canada Child Benefit, that benefit will be clawed back when your household income reaches $79,000. I want politicians, I'm encouraging politicians, Generation Squeeze is encouraging politicians to look at that difference. Why do we start clawing back income support at around $79,000 for families with kids, but we leave it to $180,000 for a retired couple? That mismatch, I think, reflects a kind of structural ageism in Canadian public finance that needs to be addressed. That would be one way that if we were to ask financially secure retirees who have household incomes over $100,000 to begin considering accepting a little less in their OAS subsidy, that could free billions and billions of dollars. And those billions and billions of dollars could be used partly to pay down deficits, maybe to invest in NATO commitments to get to 2% of GDP for the military, to deal with other risks from Trump. But some of it also could go to dramatically accelerating or like meeting the costs of what Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Carney were putting forward for housing. And we could say, hey, didn't really say anything about post-secondary. Help these people out to reduce their student debts. That is something we could do by asking financially secure retirees to accept a little less. So some of it can go to support their kids and grandchildren's generation. And one last thing, you talked about a New Deal. That'll be funny language for a Hub audience, which probably associates that with a really left of center government in the US. We did talk about a New Deal for families a decade ago. The language I use now is more around compensation. And I would love to explore that with you now. I think the data really show Canadian politics ask millennials and Gen Z to make a number of sacrifices to safeguard the well-being of an older generation. And we need to start acknowledging that sacrifice and then thinking about how to compensate it. And I think that's where both the Conservatives and Liberals haven't pushed far enough. And I think if Mr. Poilievre, looking toward the next election, really wants to cement his capturing of a younger perspective, thinking about that language of compensation will be really provocative and interesting.
I mean, it's all interesting ideas, and there's a lot of merit to the argument from what I could tell. But politically, it sounds like a very, very difficult thing to sell to for any political party to sell, especially during an election campaign. I mean, do you believe that there is a political path for some of these policies that you seem to be suggesting is a path forward?
So we had to ramp up our work on OAS, in particular last fall when the Bloc Québécois was making a very uninformed, non-evidence supported recommendation that we just add another $1,000 of OAS subsidy to rich and poor seniors alike. And in that time, we had to go on defense. That's a bad idea. And over time, we were making some headway to then have people think differently about OAS more generally. So we ran some polling. And I think the polling is really instructive. 75% of Canadians, including 3/4 of retirees, are open to the idea of revising the income level after which OAS subsidies are clawed back. And they're open to thinking about, hey, that could start around 100,000 of income. That would still be more generous than what happens for the Canada Child Benefit, but less generous than now. And it would allow us to better target our use of scarce tax dollars and repurpose savings for other important needs. 3/4 of Canadians support that. It is not different across voters of the different political parties. In addition to that, politicians sometimes are skeptical of polls, and they're worried when they go to election time. We didn't push super hard on saying, parties, please, make this promise to us now in an election. But we have been growing a cadre of older allies in Gen Squeeze. We have about 47,000 people who are in our network, and many of them who are older. And now some of those financially secure retirees are putting their faces and names to videos where they're saying, I'm willing to take less OAS if some of those savings can be repurposed to help eliminate poverty for other seniors and or help my kids and grandchildren's generation. And I think that's the kind of that gets to the heart of why Gen Squeeze is a think and change tank. We need to build social support. We need to build political cover for politicians to be able to act on the evidence to change some of these status quo policies that have been in place for decades. And I'm really deeply, deeply appreciative of an older group of Gen Squeeze allies who are putting their voices out there saying that they would be open to accepting less in a public way. And I think that that's the kind of thing, if we scale up, it's inevitable. I really do believe this is inevitable. There is no getting around the operating deficits at the federal level that are being driven by OAS, whether you're Mr. Carney or you're Mr. Poilievre. Well, I'd happy to go into that more, although I feel like I just got on a soapbox. So I'm going to hand it back to you.
No, I mean, I was just about to ask you, we just had an election. I mean, how, what did Mr. Carney's platform have to say about generational fairness?
Yeah, so on one hand, I think the Liberals deserve a lot of credit because after working with Generation Squeeze, their 2024 federal budget promised fairness for every generation. Now, the politics mattered because they were also reading the polling that had seen Mr. Poilievre attracting a younger demographic interest. And so I think they were looking for ways to counter that. And one of my fears is that now the conservatives use the phrase fairness for every generation as a partisan issue, as opposed to that's just how we need to make Canada work. We want to be good ancestors. We want to leave at least as much as we inherited. And politics right now is doing the opposite. If you then look, Mr. Carney's language in his platform continues to talk about how millennials and Gen Z are losing out on the dream that their hard work should be able to bring a home in reach. That's I think important for them to be saying, because it has been weaponized politically that they're the responsibility for it. They, as government, bear some responsibility for it, but it's a longer term trend. And so I'm hopeful that pathway to a conversation about generational fairness can continue, but there's so much work. And if you look at both the Carney and the Poilievre platforms, both of them are baking in much larger increases for boomers and the aging population than they are for millennials and Gen Z. That was already part of the previous government's budgeting over the last many years. It's institutional momentum. And then the largest increases proposed by both Poilievre and Carney were really for those over 65.
Yeah. So, I mean, why do you, if you look at the election campaign we just had, I mean, you wouldn't think that you would be very optimistic that the politics would allow for an improvement in the situation. I mean, how would you rank this election campaign on that front?
I think we're getting closer and closer to recognizing that some of our political narratives are just outdated. And so I do believe Mr. Poilievre has a genuine concern to balancing the budget. I do believe Mr. Carney has a genuine concern to balance the budget or balance the operating budget, to use his language. But the biggest part of the operating budget is old age security. So I think that soon it will just be impossible to deny this issue. I mean, former Prime Minister Harper did try and move us in this direction by changing the age of eligibility for OAS. He did it such a way that it only came into effect in 2023, so long after he was in office, and it was never going to affect boomers. I think that was such an interesting part of the design. But no matter what now, OAS is a massive drag on our fiscal foundation, and we just need to make it safe to talk about that. And sometimes people, I think the risk is that when we talk about changing OAS, we are going to be mean-spirited toward financially insecure retirees. And that's going to then drum up a brigade of people showing up at political offices with their canes, expressing anger. But what I love about Gen Squeeze is, our financially secure retiree allies are showing the opposite, that they're concerned about their legacy and that we can be protecting financially insecure retirees. But we need to recognize right now we have a much more blunt policy that is spending inefficiently on those who are not insecure. And now, with Canada being at risk because of Mr. Trump, and we have to think not just as consumers, but as citizens. And like, what are we going to do to stand on guard for this country? I've been long making the case that those of us who have financial security, and I'm a 50-year-old homeowner in Metro Vancouver, gained quite a lot of wealth from my home. I'm like, what responsibilities do those of us with financial security have to stand up? And I'm hoping this moment of wanting to stand on guard for Canada can both defend us from our risks from our US neighbor, but also give us a new moment of citizenship to think about how do we restore the strength of our fiscal foundation, which is really the starting point for tackling so many other challenges.
Housing is also obviously a big part of that conversation. I mean, what did you think about Carney's platform on the issue of housing? He had some proposals there around a housing or building agency for housing, and talking about cutting the GST for new home buyers. I mean, what did you think about his proposals on housing as far as generational fairness is concerned?
Well, tackling housing was really at the center of the economic agenda to address generational fairness. Housing is the way in which age is interacting with housing is transforming class dynamics in Canada. Mr. Poilievre used to be really strong at saying this, like you could be a bus driver or a nurse in the late 70s or 80s, and with your earnings in that day, you could have bought a home. And the reality is when you did that in Hamilton or Kelowna, you now have an asset that's over $1 million and it's pushing you pretty close to the global 1%. By contrast, you could be a young person with good education. You're a young lawyer. She's making 6 figures and she's struggling in Hamilton or Kelowna to find a 3-bedroom place to rent. And so the concept of who is affluent and who is not is really changing, not based on what earnings are doing, but based on the way in which earnings are interacting with the cost of living. And for a younger demographic, that is really making it harder to cover the major cost of living. For those who got into the housing system some decades ago, your purchase of that asset has now made you much more affluent. So given that context, you're right, housing has to be the thing we tackle to promote generational fairness. And I would say, before we got the costed platforms, I didn't see a ton of difference between Mr. Carney and Mr. Poilievre's approaches. But once we saw the costed platforms, you could see there actually was a big difference in dollar figures. So the economic stimulus that Mr. Poilievre wants to put in over the next 3 to 4 years is about $14 billion of additional stimulus. That's about a third more than what we're currently doing. By contrast, Mr. Carney was doing $24 billion of additional stimulus through tax cuts, new spending, et cetera. And that's about 50% more. I think the stimulus matters at this instance. But once you move beyond the dollar comparison, I'm a big skeptic of both Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Carney when they say, we're going to build 500,000 units of new housing each year. Like, I love the ambition. I want them to be successful in that ambition, but I don't want to organize our housing policy around a unicorn. And I'm skeptical in the years ahead that we can meet that ambition. So let's have the stretch goal, but let's recognize for the foreseeable future, millennials, Gen Z, and those who follow in their footsteps are going to be asked to be paying far higher rents than people did decades ago, take on far larger mortgages, abandon dreams of home ownership, especially home ownership close to where they work or study. The idea that you can send your kid out to play in the backyard rather than on the balcony. And we need to recognize that we have done that because the political bargain in this country across parties has said, we want to protect the wealth that older homeowners have gained in their homes because that's their quote unquote retirement nest eggs. That's their banking on for their retirement security. And so then we ask younger people to suffer a lower standard of living. That's the source of the anger in Canada right now for younger people. That's the source of less happiness. We should talk about the happiness data in Canada. And so we need to start compensating millennials and Gen Z for the fact that they're paying higher rents and larger mortgages to protect the wealth that somebody like me and those older than me have gained. That has to be the heart of the conversation going forward.
And so how do you do that? There's how to use the tax system to do that.
Yeah, so there's a range of ways. I think one, asking financially secure retirees to accept less OAS so we can repurpose some of the current tax dollars to housing, to bringing down the cost of tuition, to making childcare not another rent-sized payment. That's part of it. I think people like your colleague Sean Spear has talked provocatively about how to potentially shelter the first $200,000 of income that somebody earns as a way to, compensate for how hard work doesn't pay off for younger people. We've never been able to cost that out. We should talk about collaborating with the hub. Like, let's go figure out how to cost that out to have a better sense of what it would mean for our fiscal circumstances. But I think the bottom line is we need to recognize that it is younger Canadians who are suffering a lower standard of living because their hard work can't pay off, because we're keeping home values higher to protect the wealth gained by previous generations. And if we don't acknowledge that and then appreciate it rather than saying, oh, those young people, if they just ate fewer pieces of avocado toast or didn't have that latte or didn't have such expensive cell phones, they too could afford their rent. Like, that is nonsense. And I think we're largely moving beyond that, but we haven't acknowledged the amazing thing they're doing. They're providing protection. And so I want Mr. Carney, I want Mr. Poilievre to start talking about that protection. And I think the more they do that, the more they are going to attract that younger demographic and solidify trends that we're seeing right now, where young folks are looking for politicians to address the housing situation. And I'm hopeful that we can push forward on that front.
I mean, there's controversially, there are some people who worry actually that some of these proposals could end up taxing home equity. I mean, what do you?
Oh yes.
What do you?
I would have been surprised had we not gone here today.
People who might be worried about that prospect.
Yeah, so I'm kind of infamous, especially with some segments in Canadian discourse, that I am the guy who wants to tax capital gains on people's homes. I will confess 100% that I wish when we started capital gains taxation 50 years ago that we hadn't exempted principal residences. I think it created an unintended consequence that when you have a tax shelter, you encourage people to go make returns on investments where it's sheltered from taxation. And so people culturally 50 years ago started thinking about housing not just as the home they wanted to make, but as an opportunity to make a really good return on investment after taxes. And that kind of over commodification of housing is part of the problem today. But I'm also on the record in the peer-reviewed literature, in many other places, that I don't think changing capital gains taxation of housing now actually addresses the intergenerational tensions. I do, however, think that we should talk more about cutting income taxes and compensating by taxing high-value homes more on an annual basis through property taxation. And so just as we have progressivity in annual income taxes, I'm on the record that would say, if you have a home over $1 million, we should start contemplating a small surtax, just make the rate a little bit higher at that next dollar of housing wealth above $1 million or $1.5 million or $2 million. Reasonable people can disagree about what the threshold is. But that is part of the tax shift proposal that drives some of the Gen Squeeze thinking, not all of it, but some of it, which says we want to reduce taxes on things we want more of, like higher incomes, and we want to increase taxes on things we want less of, like really expensive homes. And that tax shift can help not only improve generational fairness, but drive some productivity gains that are really critical for our economy right now.
Yeah. Is there anything to be done on the liability side, to making it easier, cheaper for younger Canadians to borrow? For example, I've always thought that, given the debt that younger Canadians need to take to buy a home, that over the year, this generation of Canadians, the younger generation, might be more open to higher inflation than the previous generation. For example, since inflation tends to eat into the debt, essentially. I mean, what do you think? Have you given any thought to that aspect of it?
A decent amount of thought. It's such a double-edged sword. So as the problem we have in Canada is home values inflating, and leaving earnings behind. Individuals want to hack that dysfunctional housing system by saying, please let me borrow more. And then what we do when we borrow more, we then bid up the price of houses, which then inflates housing values and means the next generation of people who want to get in the housing market need to borrow even more. And so I'm deeply nervous about that vicious cycle. I'm very in good language, I'm vexed that Statistics Canada is really weak at measuring housing inflation. It may surprise your listeners to know that, yes, housing is the biggest part of the consumer price index by which we measure inflation in this country. But when it comes to measuring the costs associated with home ownership, the StatsCan doesn't track the average price of homes. It doesn't even track how much one needs to borrow for a down payment on a typically priced home. It measures how much interest do you have to pay on whatever you've borrowed. And as a result, when interest rates go down, they tend to say that housing affordability is improving. But we know from the data there's a strong association between lower interest rates and rapidly rising home prices. And so we desperately, desperately need right now, as the Bank of Canada goes through its annual 5-year review of its agenda and its targets and so on. Right now, they're rethinking the relationship between housing and inflation. And we need to be concerned to use low interest rates to fight a range of economic harms when one of the outcomes is stimulation to drive home values up higher. At this time, I think our goal needs to be home values minimally stall. And so I'm looking for borrowing policy and lending policy to be commensurate with the idea that minimally home prices are stalling, because that's the only way to give earnings a chance to catch up over time.
Just before we wrap up, actually, I'd like to ask you a little bit about climate change, because that's also part of the Generation Squeeze agenda. Part of that agenda is, I think, a coalition you call the Intergenerational Climate Coalition. Can you tell us a little bit about that and just how climate change plays into the work you're doing?
Oh, great! Yeah, you've done your background checks to plan for today's conversation. I really appreciate that. So when we think about generational fairness and leaving at least as much as we inherited, we sound alarms when we see examples of over-extraction for an older generation from those following. And so I've already talked about sort of two kinds of over-extraction from the housing system. People my age, we've extracted so much housing wealth from the system that we leave less affordability for those who follow. I talked at the outset of our conversation about how we're extracting so many of the tax dollars to address the needs for healthy retirement for boomers that we're leaving less money left over for post-secondary childcare and housing and large deficits to millennials and Gen Z. I think in many circles in Canada, the most commonly identified example of over-extraction is from the planet's health. And the data are clear that, the degree of the amount of pollution that we put out that's harming our forests, our water, our air quality, the over-extraction that means there are fewer fish in the ocean to feed, et cetera, the quality of, increased risks of desertification in our growing areas, that means that the planet's health, on which people depend for their economic and physical well-being, is in poorer condition now than it was decades ago. And so that is another quintessential example of an intergenerational injustice. And we formed the Intergenerational Climate Coalition some years ago. It doesn't exist anymore. It was when we went to the Supreme Court, and this will annoy some Hub listeners. We went to the Supreme Court to defend the constitutionality of putting a price on pollution, because when we don't pay for our pollution now, we betray our kids. As simple as that. We asked them to pay more to clean up the messes that we're making with pollution now. And so we were a stalwart defender of the consumer price on carbon. And we are now, since that battle has largely been lost, we are a staunch defender of improving the industrial price on pollution. It is clearly the most significant policy tool we have to address pollution concerns in the country. And I just want to I just want to remind listeners that, when my mom was rearing me, the family value she taught was, if you make a mess, clean it up. And politicians are making it harder to teach our kids that family value, because they're responding, well, political leaders say you don't have to clean up your pollution messes, so why the hell do I need to clean up my bedroom? And I'm deeply concerned that the family value that we have at home, clean up your mess, is not being brought to the world of politics. It's an intergenerational harm. And I don't know any parent or grandparent who doesn't want to make sacrifices in their family life for their kids and grandchildren. And yet as our politics is asking our kids and grandchildren to sacrifice their well-being now and into the future for convenience of avoiding some difficult political conversations right now.
Right. Well, Paul Kershow, thank you for your insights and your time. And thanks to all of you for listening. You can find more of our coverage at thehub.ca. I'm Theo Argitis. See you next time on Hub Dialogues.